Thank you very much, Dominic. It's wonderful to be here. Can you hear me at the back okay? Good, okay, then I don't need to hold a mic the whole time. It's great to be here with all these societies this evening to celebrate and reflect on this great event. And I want to make this quite interactive, so let me start with a few questions. First of all, hands up if you existed in 1989. Gosh, a surprising number for students. Hands up those who didn't exist in 1989. Well, I think a clear majority. You can define the beginning of existence according to your own terms. Okay, how many of you in this room lived or live in a country or territory which then was behind the so-called Iron Curtain, and I'm including Yugoslavia and Albania? Hands up. Yeah, quite a few. Okay, how many of you who did not exist in 1989, so those who did exist, be silent, would still consider it a really important event in your lives? Think about it. Hands up. Have a think. Yeah, I can see some people thinking, wondering, and then putting their hands up. I think if you put your hand up, it's a pretty good call. In giving a talk like this, I sometimes feel like a veteran of the Second World War in about 1981. You know, my father was a D-Day veteran. But although I was only born in 1955, D-Day, 1944, was a very important event in my life. So it's entirely possible to have an event which you didn't experience, which is nonetheless very important in your life. And 1989 was in yours if you lived in one of those countries or live in one of those countries, because let me tell you, were it not for 1989, you might still be living in the Soviet bloc, right? And your entire life chances would be completely different. And the chances are you wouldn't be able to come and study at Oxford. You certainly wouldn't be a citizen of the European Union, living in a country in NATO and so on. Because empires can take a very long time declining. Think about the Ottoman Empire. In the past they got pushed by insurrections and uprisings, but nobody has known how you can force a nuclear-armed empire to give up its territory, its colonies. Nobody could have forced the nuclear-armed Soviet Union. There's a historical theory, the book by a man called Stephen Kotkin, who some of you will know, which sort of argues that the regimes just collapsed. He says it was like a bankruptcy. What happened in East Germany was like a Ponzi scheme that collapsed. This is nonsense. This is complete nonsense. However bankrupt these states were, and they could be heavily indebted, and they were, no one could have forced them to give up power. So the French philosopher Henri Bergson has a great phrase. He talks about the illusions of retrospective determinism, the almost irresistible temptation to believe that what actually happened somehow had to happen. So don't fall prey to the illusions of retrospective determinism. It seems to you obvious now that 1989 happened, and so you're in relatively free countries which are in the EU and NATO and so on and so forth. Nothing of the kind. If you'd been in one of these countries 50 years ago, the division of Europe would have seemed to you like a fact of physical geography. Physical geography. It was like the Alps. So what happened in 1989 was like the Alps collapsing. Even in November 1988, just before, nobody had any idea that this could happen. I dug in an old cupboard and looked up actually one of my notebooks from November 1988 from traveling around there. And I chanced upon an entry from June 1988 where I met some interesting young students in Budapest from an organization a few of you may have heard of, called Fidesz. Yeah? Anyone recognize that? What's his name here? Ah, yes, Viktor Orban. There he is. Yeah. They have great plans for Hungary. They say a great legal system, rule of law, human rights, new constitution, freedom of association, freedom of the press, multi-party democracy, all good things. That was young Viktor Orban in November 1988. But even at that point, nobody imagined that just a year later, effectively, the Soviet external empire, because the Soviet Union was, of course, an external and an internal empire, the Soviet external empire would be finished. Now, I'm going to ask you another question. How many of you have actually read The Magic Lantern? Hands up. Ah, wonderful. Very few of you. Well, that's great for two reasons. First of all, because a couple of stories I'm going to tell you will not be familiar to you because you've read the book before. And secondly, because you've got a treat in store and can buy it afterwards. So, as Dominic mentioned, I spent a lot of the time in the 1980s. I was actually foreign editor of The Spectator, traveling around Central and Eastern Europe. And because I'd been traveling there for 10 years, and particularly I got to know all the dissidents, got to know Václav Havel, Lech Wałęsa, Adam Michnik, they were János Kiss in Hungary. These were all my friends. And so when things really started happening in 1989, I was, of course, right on the spot. It started, of course, as you all know, with the round table negotiations in Poland, a novel formula invented in 1988, early 89, which led to the first semi-free election in the Soviet bloc for 40 years on the 4th of June 1989. Now, I remember drinking with Bronisław Geremek and Adam Michnik, two leading figures of the Polish events, on the evening of the 4th of June. We had no idea what the result was going to be. We thought it would be a victory for Solidarity, but we had no idea that we would absolutely, I say we, Solidarity would absolutely sweep the board, right? There was nothing inevitable about it. And I've never forgotten coming back to the offices of what was then just a start-up newspaper. How many of you are Polish or know Poland here? Hands up. Yeah, there. Well, you'll all know Gazeta Wyborcza, which of you think of as a very old newspaper. But then it was a very young newspaper because its existence had only been agreed at the round table for the semi-free election. Hence its name, Gazeta Wyborcza, Electoral Gazette, for the election on the 4th of June. It was actually produced in a creche, in a kindergarten, because they couldn't find a proper office. And I've never forgotten coming back to the office of Gazeta Wyborcza and seeing on a small black and white TV screen the first footage from the massacre on Tiananmen Square, right? Because remember, it was the same day, 4th of June. And you know what? On the 3rd of June 1989, China and the entire Soviet bloc, as we then called it, were still in the same, essentially, world. It was still possible that China could have gone down the path of reform, and that the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe could have gone down the path of repression. By the 5th of June 1989, China and Eastern Europe had parted company forevermore, right? Because you would have the crackdown in China, but the semi-free election, which effectively ended communism in Poland. On to Hungary for the ceremonial reburial of Imre Nagy, the leader of the 1956 revolution, where the star of the show was, anyone? Star of the show?
Viktor Orban.
Viktor Orban, this then young, then slim, then liberal, apparently, student leader who I'd met in November. And he was the star of the show, not only because he was a great speaker, because he was a great speaker, but because he deliberately broke the informal agreement between all the opposition speakers at this great event on Hero Square. So the deal was, we're not going to push the envelope. Remember, this was the 16th of June, so Tiananmen had been just a week and a bit before. We're not going to talk about demanding Soviet troops leave Hungary, right? And Orban deliberately broke this taboo, which made him the star of the show, so he knew what he was doing. But actually, interestingly, Tiananmen Square, although it was disastrous for China, was very helpful in Eastern Europe, because wherever one went, people were talking about the danger of what in Germany they called chinesische Lösung, the Chinese solution. And there was a very real crackdown, a real danger at every stage of a crackdown. For example, Leipzig, the 9th of October. It came very, very close. But both sides, those in power and the oppositions, saw the danger, right? So it was a helpful deterrent in a sense, and the worst was avoided. And so, of course, you have the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989. But by the way, I got into East Germany in I think early July 1989, having been refused a visa for quite a long time. And I went to see the small group of dissidents in East Berlin. And they said, yeah, well, it's happening in Poland, of course, and it can happen in Hungary, but it couldn't possibly happen here. Couldn't possibly happen here. This is Germany. And the Berlin Wall could never come down. And that was the dissidents in July 1989. And then on from there, of course, to the original Velvet Revolution, named, by the way, most likely by a French journalist. That often happens in these stories. And then Václav Havel and others pick it up, and so it becomes a self-naming. That's often the way these processes happen. I got there on about the 5th day of the Velvet Revolution. There's an account of it in the book. Sought out Václav Havel in his favorite basement pub. And I said to him, you know, Václav, in Poland it took 10 years. In Hungary it took 10 months. In East Germany it took 10 weeks. Maybe in Czechoslovakia it'll take 10 days. And he said, that's great. Hang on a minute. And he hauled over the Samizdat video team and got me to repeat that. And so this bombo was broadcast and spread around, and he repeated it. It took a little bit longer than 10 days, but it was very quick and very magical. And then, of course, Bulgaria and, with some violence, Romania followed. At the time, what I'm trying to convey to you is we thought this was completely miraculous. It was just unbelievable, day by day. How could it go on getting just better and better? And do you know what? We were right. And anyone who thinks it was inevitable with hindsight is wrong. Because it was an extraordinary example of what Machiavelli calls fortuna, of good fortune, both in the larger, the macro and the micro. So macro, you have 4 big developments that converge in 1989. Gorbachev, perestroika and glasnost, which so much depends on the role of the individual in history. That one person, Gorbachev. Any different Soviet leader had been a different story. The dissident and democratic opposition movements in Central and Eastern Europe, which took what was essentially an amber light from Moscow. Because, of course, Gorbachev didn't want these countries to go the whole way, and turned it into a green light to go the whole way. With their dissident strategies of social self-organization, of using people power, mass pressure, 300,000 people on the Wenceslas Square in Prague, for example, to put pressures on the power holders to negotiate a compromise transition, right? That is the new model of revolution. And if you ask what was so spectacularly new about 1989, I would say it produced a new model of revolution. The model of 1789, which had been replicated in 1917 and in 1949 in China, was intrinsically violent. Violence was essential to the revolution. Simon Sharma says violence was the motor of the French Revolution. Chairman Mao said, revolution is not a dinner party. And through a conscious process of learning, what we got to with this new model of revolution, and that's very much thanks to the democratic oppositions. The third big channel is Western Europe. Remember, this was an extraordinarily dynamic period in Western Europe, in the development of what became the European Union. Jacques Delors as Commission President, the project of the single market, the project of the euro. And what that meant was Western Europe seemed overwhelmingly attractive to societies behind the Iron Curtain, right? So again and again, if I walked around the streets of Prague or Budapest or Warsaw or Sofia or Belgrade or wherever, people would say to me, I just want us to be a normal country. And what they meant by normal was like West Germany or France or Britain, a prosperous, free country in the European Union. And the final big stream that flowed into this extraordinary, miraculous moment was US policy. And by sheer good fortune, we had Reagan I, who was the Cold Warrior, who showed the Soviet Union they could not win the arms race. And then when Gorby comes along, you have Reagan II, who turns on a dime and becomes the world's greatest peacenik. Let's give up all our nuclear weapons, he says to Gorby in Reykjavik. Mrs. Thatcher is horrified. And so that the turn from Reagan I to Reagan II was absolutely essential, right? And then, even better, we get rid of Reagan, and come 1989, we have George H.W. Bush, who's a very cautious, pragmatic, careful guy, whose motto in 1989 and 1990 was, don't dance on the Berlin Wall. Don't gloat in the triumph of the United States. And I think Ronald Reagan would probably have gone and literally danced on the Berlin Wall, right? And so those four things, all of which come together, and then day by day, of course, in the events. For example, in Berlin on the 9th of November, you have a series of happy accidents. I can talk about them in discussion. So I would suggest 1989 was the best year in European history. I'd be interested to hear any competitors in the discussion. It invented this new model of revolution. It opened the door for the other half of Europe. And what we missed in the subsequent years was that it was quite exceptional, right? So as the years went by, through the 1990s and 2000s, we, broadly speaking, liberal Europeans and in the United States, came to convince ourselves that this was the way history was going, that it was going to go on going this way. So, for example, when the Arab Spring happened 20 years later, a bunch of journalists, many of whom had covered the Velvet Revolutions of 1989, said, this is the 1989 for the Middle East. And of course, it was absolutely nothing of the kind. And so the great mistake we made was to take these events which were so exceptional and think that they were the normal. Okay, I'm now going to do two things relatively quickly because I want to have time for discussion. First of all, I'm going to look at what followed and just make a few points about what I call the post-wall period. So you have the post-war period, the period after 1945, and then what I call the post-wall period, which goes from the 9th of November 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, to the 24th of February 2022. Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which ends finally the post-war period. Now, you've often heard people say, I'm sure, oh, all that end of history bunk, liberal triumphalism, people talking about it as a holiday from history, right? You've all heard people say this, haven't you? Not so. The post-war period is a game of two halves. Okay? So in the first half, which goes from 1989 to 2007, we actually did quite extraordinary things. At the end of 1989, we had absolutely no idea how you were going to turn a command centrally planned economy in countries which had no rule of law, no independent judiciary, very little private capital, no private property, no multi-party democracy, virtually no free media, into something like a market economy and a liberal democracy. The joke at the time was, we know that you can turn an aquarium into fish soup, but can you turn a fish soup back into an aquarium? And you know what? We did, or you did, or in your case, your parents did, probably. Some pretty odd aquariums, I grant you that, but still, they were and are aquariums. We did make these transitions to something like a market economy and something like a liberal democracy and something like the rule of law. And what is more, virtually all these countries except Ukraine, and I will come to that, and Moldova, and of course Armenia and Georgia and Belarus, were brought into the EU, which only became the EU in the 1990s, and NATO. That's incredible. That is just extraordinary. The Baltic states, which did not even exist on the political map of Europe in 1989. Yeah, look at a map, 1989, no Baltic states. Though, of course, they always existed in the hearts and minds of their own people. There they are, today, free countries in the EU, in NATO. So actually that first half of the post-war period was a period of incredible achievement, unprecedented achievement, right? It's in the second half, which starts in 2008, with two near-simultaneous events, the global financial crisis and Putin's seizure of two chunks of Georgia, where we are launched into a cascade of crises, each, so to speak, reinforcing the other. So, for example, the financial crisis segues into the Great Recession and then the Eurozone crisis, which did such damage to Southern Europe. Viktor Orban, that young idealistic student, starts demolishing democracy in Hungary already in 2010 with a supermajority, a constitutional majority in parliament. 2014, you have, of course, the seizure of Crimea and the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Ukrainians always remind us the war began in 2014, not just in 2022. The migration crisis, Brexit, Trump, the incredible successes of the AfD in Germany and Marine Le Pen in France, COVID, all the way down to the beginning of the largest war in Europe since 1945. I would be happy to talk in discussion about where we went wrong in that period, about the sources of that. On Ukraine, I would just say that we were not wrong to try to help Russia to modernize, to democratize, to become a more normal nation state. But when the empire started striking back, Georgia 2008, big time Ukraine 2014, we should have said, aha, we recognize this from history. You know what happens with declining empires? They don't like it. Ask the British. Ask the French. Ask the Portuguese. We all, colonial powers, fought quite brutal wars to try to defend their empires. And so we should have recognized this as a recurrent historical phenomenon. The empire strikes back. And I would argue if we'd had a much more decisive reaction in 2014, we, and particularly Ukraine, might not be in the mess it's in today. I'd be happy to talk to you about neoliberalism. If you'd like to ask me a question about neoliberalism, we can take apart what we mean and what we don't mean by neoliberalism. But clearly the populisms in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe have both economic and cultural dimensions. They have many features which are quite familiar in Germany or France or Spain or Britain, and they have some features which are peculiar to these countries themselves, and I'll be happy to discuss that at greater length in the discussion period. But what I would say, and I think I made this point recently in a column in The Guardian just back from Prague. As you know, the election result there now, Andrej Babiš is coming back into power with two eccentric right-wing parties, hard-right parties. It's just a variant of normality, right? It's not an East European peculiarity, right? In a way, people said in 1989, we just want to be a normal country. Well, in a way you are. The trouble is that normality itself has shifted, right? So that actually Nigel Farage would be perfectly at home in Romania. And Marine Le Pen would be quite at home in Poland. Where should we send Geert Wilders? Where should we send Geert Wilders? Bulgaria, maybe. These are all variants of our contemporary normality with distinctive characteristics, but even the countries of this region vary very considerably. Also, for example, in their attitudes to the war in Ukraine. Again, we could talk about that. So, you know, in a way, Eastern Europe no longer exists. Now, final section, before throwing it open, I want to talk to you and about you now. So one of the points I make in this, in my book Homelands, is that the history of Europe over the last century is essentially made by a series of distinctive political generations. You have the 14ers, the people who were shaped by their experience of the First World War. The 39ers, people who were shaped by their experience of the Second World War and therefore built the beginnings of what's become the European Union. De Gasperi, Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, Charles de Gaulle, and so on, François Mitterrand, 39ers. You have the 68ers, very distinctive generation, and you have the 89ers. Who were the 89ers? Interesting question. The 68ers were people who were young in 1968, and they actually made the action, right? They built the barricades. They did the student protests from Prague and Warsaw to Paris and Berlin and indeed Berkeley. Now, the people who really made the action in Central and Eastern Europe in 1989 were not so much the young. Havel, Michnik, Geremek, Wałęsa, Arpad Gönc, János Kiss, so on and so forth. Most of them were either 68ers or even 39ers. They were a much older generation. There is a group of people, I think, who I would call 89ers. And they are people like Anne Applebaum, Tim Snyder, Jan Werner Müller, Ivan Krastev, names that will be well known to you. The distinctive 89er is someone who was a sort of young at that point, somewhere between East and West. So both Ivan Krastev and Tim Snyder were my students at St. Anthony's. Anne Applebaum was actually our student at St. Anthony's. So it's between East and West, right? And those are, I think that's a distinctive generation. But of course, there's no way you can be 89ers. I'm talking to the students now, so forgive me for those who are slightly older. Karl Mannheim said your formative political experiences are normally made between the age of about 17 and 25. Hands up those of you who are between 17 and 25 now. Please, hands up. Yeah, well, that's most of you, with a few exceptions. Okay, so I'll be very curious to hear what your formative political experiences are. Really, I'll be very interested. But I'll tell you what I'd like you to be. I would like you to be 22ers, 22er, because the period we're now in, starting with the full-scale war in Ukraine, now well into its fourth year, is one in which everything we've achieved since 1945 in Europe is under threat. Under existential threat, right? So since that moment, February 2022, Europe has faced three enormous shocks. The Putin shock, the Xi shock, and the Trump shock. Each of them has to do with a particular individual, but is much larger than that. So Putin shock is obvious. We've talked about it. A revanchist, neo-imperialist, authoritarian Russia which wants to subjugate the whole of Ukraine. And today is obviously, with the current peace plan, not a good day for Ukraine. And that's the first thing we face. The Xi shock, we have a Chinese superpower which is entirely happy to become the closest partner of Russia while Russia is waging a neo-colonial war against Ukraine. But it's not just China. It's also India, it's also Turkey, it's also Brazil, it's also South Africa. All of them are happy to have good relations with Russia. And what is more, as a result of globalization actually, so in a sense as an indirect result of 1989, these non-Western great and middle powers, between them have sufficient wealth and power to counterbalance the West, right? So we threw the kitchen sink in sanctions at Russia. Could have done more, but it was a pretty big package of sanctions. The Russian economy has done better than the British economy over the last 3 years. It's suffering now a bit, but it's done partly because they prepared for it, but mainly because India buys the oil that the West would no longer buy. China supplies the spare parts and the technology that Germany is not supplying. They have all these partners there. So that's the Xi shock. And then the Trump shock, well, I don't need to tell any of you the Trump shock, but it's not just Donald Trump. It is that even after Trump, we can probably no longer rely, we Europeans, on the United States to support Ukraine sufficiently, which is the most urgent task, and then to be the ultimate backstop for our own security. And this comes at a time when we in Europe have enormous internal problems of our own. Apart from demography and people's allergy to immigration and debt and the strains on our economy, there's what I call the battle of two Europes. In all our countries, and that's why I talk about the Czech Republic as in a way a normal country, we have a battle which, simplifying slightly, is between a liberal, internationalist, pro-European side and an anti-liberal, nationalist, populist, Eurosceptic side. 57 different variants on that story, but wherever you go, there's that story. And in most places, it's kind of 50-50, right? So 15th of October 2023 in Poland, great moment, I was there, parliamentary election, it just goes the liberal way, okay? But then Romania presidential election, yeah, it just goes the right way. But then the Polish presidential election, it goes the other way. But it's, 52, 48, 51, 49, it's very close every time. Czech Republic, Babiš, but the Netherlands, the Liberals, just prevailed under Rob Yetten. And so it goes on. So you are going to have, and this is why I'm speaking to you, in your countries, all our countries, in the next few years, one of these rather existential elections, right, where it's going to be on a knife edge. The next one, very interestingly, Hungary. April next year, probably the 12th of April. And you know what? For the first time, Viktor Orban is behind, and Peter Magyar's TISA party is actually leading in the polls. That will be a very important moment. If Orban, who in a way is a pioneer of the erosion of liberal democracy, could be removed in an election, then the problems will begin, all the dilemmas of post-populism, which you see in Poland. Polish parliamentary election in 2027 is going to be very important, and many more. So my appeal to you is quite simply, students, we need you to have some of the spirit of 1989, right? Because everything that has been achieved so far, which enables you to come and study at Oxford, which gives you the life chances you have, which are now just as good or slightly better than those of a young Brit, is under threat. And we need you to have the will to fight and the strategy to ensure that the right size wins. If it looks to you like an uphill struggle, think what it looked like to Václav Havel in 1984. When I met Václav Havel in 1984, he had just come out of 4 very tough years in prison. And it looked as if Czechoslovakia was still under a thick level of ice. There were very, very few signs of any change. Charter 77 was only a couple of thousand people. But he had the imagination and the optimism of the will to say, we can change this country, given time. And he didn't know that just 5 years later he would be on Wenceslas Square with Alexander Dubček talking to a crowd of 300,000 people. He didn't know that. For all he knew, it could have taken 20, 30, 50 years. He might be dead by it happened. But he had that optimism of the will, and some of you will know a wonderful comment that he made, actually in an interview in 1988, about optimism. He said, optimism is not prognostication. It is not the belief that things will necessarily turn out well. It is the belief that there are things worth fighting for, whether or not they turn out well in the end. And I think that's such a great motto for us today. So, paraphrasing Lord Kitchener in that famous recruiting poster to all of you, your continent needs you. Thank you very much. I look forward to discussion.